disappoint any mathematicians, but I'm actually going to be sort of wearing my second hat today. So yeah, I am a sort of math specialist, mastery specialist, but I'm actually going to be talking a little bit about sort of training and induction for novice teachers today. So I'll see if I can throw some maths in along the way. There'll definitely be some graphs, but we'll make a start. So just a little bit about me to start with. So I am from the north and very happy to be talking at Brewhead Cleethorpes, although unfortunately I'm from the other side of the Humber Estuary. I'm from York originally, but my wife is from Cleethorpes, so I'll take that as honorary membership. I've been a teacher for about 11 years, in Leeds for a while. I also taught in Poland for a year, and I currently work in London. And I'm deputy head at Angel Oak Academy. That's a school in Peckham in South London, in a sort of very deprived area. And I've worked there for the past 6 years and sort of been part of its journey and its improvement, which has been really exciting. And last year, I became head of the Step Ahead Teaching School Alliance, and that's where I work with Matt, who spoke earlier. And we do a lot of teacher training, CPD for teachers, supporting schools, and a variety of other things. So that's a little bit about me and what I do. I'm going to talk to you about a trip that I took last year, last August and September. And I was able to take a trip to New York and also to Boston. And it was a free trip for me, fully funded, which was absolutely incredible. And I was over there for about 4 weeks. And all of that is because of the work of a charity, the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust. And as my first slide said, I am a Churchill Fellow, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what that means and what I did and what I found. So I'm going to start off and just tell you a bit about the Trust and the Churchill Fellowship Programme and the work that it does. I'm going to give you a bit of context about my travels, what I was going over there to look at, why I decided to go where I did and see the places that I saw. I'll go into the details of what I actually did on my travels. And then I'm going to share with you my sort of findings and recommendations, some of what I learned while I was in the States, in New York and Boston. And then we'll finish up with the chance for you to ask some questions. So first, just a bit about the Winston Churchill Memorial Trust. It's a charity, and it was established just after Churchill died in 1965. And there were a huge number of sort of financial gifts and donations that were made by the public, and that sort of funded the setting up of this trust. And they award sort of between 100 and 150 Churchill Fellowships per year. And what the Churchill Fellowship is, their sort of tagline, which I like a lot, is travel to learn, return to inspire. And they fully fund these grants, these research grants. It's important to note that they're not, I suppose, they're not formal academic research grants. Anyone can apply, and you know, if they have an idea for a project that they'd like to study, and they get funded for sort of 4 to 8 weeks of travel, and it's got to involve international travel. It's this idea that we can sort of go abroad, travel, find things out from other countries, and then sort of come back and use what we've learned in our own country. And so I suppose what you get out of it is this incredible opportunity to travel and to go on the sort of international visits. But then the bit that you have to contribute yourself then is you have to write a fellowship report, which you share, and I'm sort of sharing my report with you here now. And then you have to sort of try and spread the word as much as you can within your sector and try to change things for the better. So this is the first time since I've had my report accepted by the Churchill Memorial Trust that I'm sharing this. So you're the first people to hear it. And just out of interest for you, because if this sounds, you know, like an attractive proposition, it definitely is. So I do advise you to look into the Churchill Fellowship, and there's some of the areas where they award Churchill Fellowships in, obviously education being a key one there. So I'm going to talk to you now a little bit about the context of my travels and what things were looking like in terms of teacher education at the time, and I think are still looking like now, and what that sort of led me to look into, and what it led to me researching. I'm going to share a graph with you first, just let you have a look at that. So this is a report from a report from NFER, and this is specifically looking at secondary teacher numbers. But as you can see there, pupil numbers were starting to rise based on the sort of 2010 baseline, and were projected to rise even further. But the number of teachers in schools were dropping off, and that's obviously a problem. We can't have numbers of teachers going up and up and up, and number of pupils going up and up and up, and have fewer and fewer teachers in the system. Just another graph. So hopefully you can see this pattern of each sort of subsequent few years, our retention rates are getting worse and worse. A higher proportion of our teachers are leaving the profession, especially early on in the first 5 years. And the most recent set of data show that new teachers who join us after 5 years, basically 67%, so 2/3 of them are still in teaching, but that means 1/3 of early career teachers in the first 5 years of their career are leaving, and they're leaving the profession. And if our pupil numbers are rising and our teacher numbers are falling, and we're not recruiting enough teachers, but also we're not retaining them, this is going to, continue to become a problem, and become a bigger problem. I think some people have scoffed at the use of the word crisis to describe the situation, but I think that's certainly the way that the trend seems to be going, and that we might well be heading for a crisis in education, just in terms of the number of teachers that we need. Just another bit of context as well, and this is something that Matt alluded to. These graphs are looking at SATs results from the end of Key Stage 2 over the last few years. And Matt was talking about this, this 25% of students who are not getting it in maths, but really we're having a similar picture in terms of reading and grammar. We've got in the reading test last year, we're looking at more than a quarter not getting the expected standard. Bit better in maths, 79%, but still 1 in 5 not quite getting there. Similar in grammar. And this just, this can't be right. This can't be good enough that nationally, 1 in 4 pupils is not able to pass on the reading test. I suppose just a note of caution of looking at SATs results. It's important to remember that these assessments are norm referenced, and that means that the pass mark, as I'm sure you know, varies depending on how well the national cohort that year has done. So essentially, if all children do really, really well in a test, the pass mark would have to then go up considerably. But I think those of you who teach in primary and are familiar with those tests, the sort of scores that you have to get to reach the expected standard are not overly high. They've certainly gone up in recent years, but most children who've been well educated and taught to read and do maths well should be able to access those tests. That's my feeling. And that's not happening at the moment. And we can also look at secondary schools, and really we're seeing similar patterns as well. So if we take English language potentially and look at the 2019 column, we've got 70% getting a 4 or above, in their English language GCSE, but that means 30% are not. They're not getting that all important 4, so what used to be the C, that sort of gold standard that you need to be moving on, and very similar numbers of maths. So we're just not getting the outcomes that we need for our pupils as well. And that's really the sort of context within which my project was sort of initially sort of built and come up with. I know this sounds quite negative and very much doom and gloom, but I think it's important that we know what the situation is nationally. I think there's a lot of really, really great stuff happening in the education sector at the moment, and movements like this, BrewEd, teachers are more and more just trying to develop themselves, get new information, and learn really, and I think that's really positive. So I think there are lots of positives out there, but I think we do need to be aware of where we are. The last bit of context that I just want to mention was this book, because this book really took all of those elements that I've just been talking about and that the data are bearing out, and just put it in really, really clear and simple terms. And anyone who's not read The Teacher Gap, I really can't recommend it enough. It's absolutely excellent. But there were the teacher gap. This idea of a teacher gap is sort of summarised in the book in there being 3 gaps in terms of teaching in this country. So that's the first. The second. And the third. And I think that the clarity and the way that they're presented in the book is so clear, and again I recommend you very much to read it. But if we think of each of those 3 gaps and sort of summarize them in a word, the first one, essentially, we're looking at retention and the teachers that we're keeping in the system. The second is looking at recruitment and looking at what we're doing to get more teachers to come into the system. And the final one really is this question around quality. Now, obviously, those 3 elements are very sort of heavily interlinked and will all affect and rely on each other to a certain extent. I think Ollie's last session on looking at cause and effect, I'm sure he could do a much nicer diagram than I've done here, but that idea that they're all sort of interrelated is really important. But I think if we start looking at these 3 elements and start looking at some of the causes that there are within the sector, I think, I'm sure you've all got some thoughts about, what might be affecting recruitment, retention and quality. And I'm sure all of you could have a go at putting something into some of those areas on the Venn diagram. I mean, these are just a few things that occurred to me when I was starting to look at this. I think as I say, we're going to have a sort of chance for Q&A at the end, so please do ask questions. And again, I'm conscious of this looking negative as well, but I don't think we can deny that there's poor leadership out there in some of our schools. Now, I'm a school leader. It's a very, very hard job, but that doesn't mean that there isn't poor leadership out there. So I think these, as I said, these 3 elements of recruitment, retention and teacher quality are all sort of interdependent. But I think sort of sitting at the nexus of all 3 of these are these 2 elements really, looking at CPD and teachers' pay and conditions. So I just want to sort of consider each of these 2 things just for a moment, and then we'll be getting on to my travels. Pay and conditions, I think there are varying opinions about that. I think, I think lots of teachers feel that they're fairly paid, but I think at the same time others disagree, and certainly on entry into the profession, I think pay isn't as high as it could be. Conditions, we're looking at a really fragmented picture nationally with local authority schools, free schools, academies, and we know that there are sort of stresses on the system in terms of paying conditions. But when I started looking at this, I guess my question for myself was, what can I do about that, about teachers' pay and conditions? And I don't really think that I can personally do very much. I can make the conditions for teachers in my own school good, but more broadly, that sort of requires a national sort of policy response. So I'm not going to look at pay and conditions. And what I chose to focus on my project on was on teacher CPD. And so through the Churchill Fellowship program, I decided that I was going to go and look at CPD and sort of initial teacher training, teacher education, but also early career development and the support that teachers get in the first few years of their careers. And I decided that I wanted to go to America to look at this. And I think, a natural question is why America in particular, if you've got the whole world to go and look at. Actually, another Churchill fellow was looking at quite similar things to me. He went to, I think, to Norway, Singapore, and Switzerland. But he was looking more, I think, around the sort of pay and conditions piece. But why America? Well, I think there were sort of three reasons, really. Firstly, our academies program, which we have, is heavily based on the sort of charter school system in America. And that's much more well developed over there, and has been going for quite a bit longer than our academies program. And I think there's a general feeling that in terms of what some of those schools are doing, they're quite a few years ahead of us. I think linked to that as well, I think there's something in the sort of American psyche about innovation, and that innovation is seen as a good thing. And I think in this country we can be much more conservative, small c conservative, about innovation sometimes. We like to do things in the way they've always been done, and we can be a bit resistant to doing things differently. Whereas I think there's a real feeling in America that you can and should do things differently, and innovation is something really to be proud of. The third reason that I decided to go to America is really that a cultural issue, I suppose, and there's been lots of interesting work done on international comparisons in terms of education for the last few years, and things like PISA and TIMSS. But I think there are some really valid questions around the sort of the validity of some of those comparisons, and that cultural factors can be quite a big confounding factor and make it difficult to make international comparisons. John Jerrim has done some really interesting work about this in the field of maths particularly, and obviously lots of schools and approaches currently talking about Singapore and Shanghai and looking at what's done in East Asia. John Jerrim looked at the children of East Asian immigrants to Australia who were the children of immigrants but had been through the Australian system, and found that those children, even though they'd never been into a Chinese school or a Singaporean school, still outperformed their sort of white Australian colleagues. And I think that there are suggestions around there that a lot of it might be cultural, and when we make comparisons between countries, it can be easy to ignore the cultural elements. We just look at the sort of basic inputs and outputs, what's happening in the classroom, what's going on there, when there's a wider picture. So I suppose by going to the States, I was trying to sort of go for somewhere that had obvious differences, but also sort of cultural similarities to the UK. And I focused in on New York and Boston for my travels because that was just an area where there was sort of a high concentration of organisations that I was sort of keen to find out more about. So my plan was to basically go out there and try and find out who are the most innovative and successful organisations involved in teacher development in the United States, whether that was schools, charities, graduate schools, charter school networks, universities, and then basically try and look a bit deeper and find out what they're doing to train their teachers and what they're doing to help their teachers to develop. And really my aims for my project were firstly to find out what that sort of best practice is in those successful organisations. think about what we could do to bring some of this back and replicate successfully in the UK. And then have a look at what we can do further. Are there people that I can work with, other organisations who can support this implementation and sort of development of some of the key practice that I was looking at. So to move on to my actual travels. So as I said, I went to New York and Boston. I spent most of the time, about 3 of the 4 weeks, in New York, and then spent about just under a week in Boston. Also, the blue star there is North Carolina, and there was a teacher training organisation who I worked with and spoke with, but I didn't actually travel there. I just dealt with them remotely. And on my travels, I spoke to a number of different organisations. I've just got some of them here. We definitely seem that we're not very imaginative in teaching. Lots of blue and sort of red logos there. But a whole host of different organisations there. So the Robertson Foundation are a charity that do a lot of work in terms of funding. Manhattanville College is a college that does a teacher training program. The graduate schools like Relay and Charles Passato. New York Men Teach and the Department for Education, or obviously their sort of version of the local authority for education. And I spoke to a lot of really interesting people within these fantastic organisations. I spoke to a lot of people, and there were a couple of organisations, sort of the ones that got away, and that I wasn't able to talk to, and they would be sort of uncommon schools. The excellent Doug Lemov, obviously being a big player there, and he was helpful in helping me try to get something set up, but it didn't end up panning out. But also Success Academies. If you haven't heard of Success Academies, I'm going to come back to them in a little bit, but they're a very, very interesting organisation. And so on my travels, essentially, I did 2 things. I interviewed people to talk about their experiences of teacher education and what they did, how they worked things, why they did that. And then I also observed teacher education in practice, and got a really interesting sense of what worked and what didn't. And within the organisations that I talked to, I sort of tried to identify and talk to people at roughly sort of 3 different levels. I tried to talk to the people who were actually receiving the teacher training. So trainee teachers, new teachers, teachers in the first 5 years of their careers, and to get a sense of how things worked for them and what processes and ways of working felt particularly helpful in their development. I also talked to lots of enactors. So they're the sort of people who would be running the training. So, might be deans within graduate schools, it might be senior leaders within schools, but the people who are actually working with those recipients day to day. And then I also talked to the leaders of a lot of the organisations to find out what they were doing at sort of like a top sort of strategic level in terms of their teacher education and their offer for their recipients. And that's what I did for that 4-week period. And what I've got now, and I'm going to go through these sort of a series of findings, so that the key things that I took away from some of these organisations, and some of these were from particular organisations, but most of them actually were things that were replicated across several organisations. And then I've also got some recommendations of how I think we should sort of develop the way that we train teachers in this country, and also develop them in the first few years of their career. I will just say here that I felt my project was kind of well timed because of the early career framework, the new ITT framework, and I think there's a lot of movement in the right direction in this sort of area anyway. I'm particularly excited about the early career framework and what that has the potential to do. But yeah, so I'm going to talk through my findings now and some of the key elements that came out from my travels. This first one is kind of really interesting, and again, might seem a little negative, but I think it's really important. And what I saw is that I saw this repeated again and again with a number of the organisations, that they made it very, very clear to people who were interested in getting into teaching that teaching isn't for everyone. And they made specific attempts to try to stop people who, you know, might not want to actually be teachers, but might be sort of falling into it, trying to stop them from sort of getting into initial teacher education. I think at the moment we you know, tend to take the opposite tack, that because we need teachers, we just try and get everyone in as quickly as we can. We try and get bums on seats. But that isn't working, because we're getting people in, we're spending a huge amount of money nationally training them up, and then we've still got 1 in 3 people leaving. So I think trying to be a bit more careful at the sort of supply end of the pipeline was something that I saw again and again. And I think this was actually really liberating, and seeing the way that they did that. And one of the ways that they did that was a lot of them removed the stigma of failure as well. So even after people had sort of got onto initial teacher education programs, if people were starting to realise that it wasn't for them, there were opportunities for them to sort of hold up their hands and say so. And one of the organisations, Charles Passato, which is one of the graduate schools in Boston, they have a point in the year in December where they basically say to their trainees, if you choose to leave before December, you won't pay us any tuition. You know, you can make the a sort of clean exit from the course, and that's absolutely fine, and we actually encourage it. Whereas again, I think often in this country we sort of take the tack that once people are in, we want to keep them in and get everyone through. But again, I think that's often not in the best interests of people in the long term, and not in the best interests of the system as well. So I think removing some of those perverse incentives around, oh, I've paid my tuition, now I'm going to just go through and see this through. It was that constant and very, very kind and very positive, but constant reminder that, you know, if this isn't for you, that's absolutely fine, and there's nothing wrong with that. So that was the sort of first thing that I noticed when I was out there. This is the second element that I noticed. And again, with a number of these organisations, it was sort of really common practice that a new teacher, whether that was a trainee teacher or actually a teacher in their first year, was not just by themselves in the classroom. They were not the sole class teacher. The teacher of record is the phrase that's often used over in the States, but they worked alongside a more experienced colleague. Now, I think, you know, if you think about programs in the UK like Teach First, where they place, you know, very new teachers into some very challenging schools, and you know, I think Teach First do incredible work. But depending on the capacity of the schools, it can easily become a bit of a sink or swim situation. You know, at my school, we use Teach First participants a lot, but we always do this. We pair them up with another teacher, not for the whole year necessarily, but certainly for the autumn term, just to help them to find their feet. But again, so many of the organisations that I was working with, their new teachers were working alongside another responsible professional who was the named class teacher. And this just gave them that confidence that they could, you know, practice their teaching, you know, have a go at things. But if they got it wrong, that there was someone else there who could guide them and who could be an excellent model to them as well. So I think, again, that was a real contrast. Whereas, you know, newly qualified teachers here, you get your job, you're there, you're in the classroom, you're the teacher, get on with it. And it's that mindset that we sort of expect people to be ready very, very quickly that seemed a real change over there to what I was seeing in the UK. The next element. So this was something that really was in every program that we looked at, some kind of instructional coaching model, and very, very often with elements of deliberate practice. I'm not going to go into what instructional coaching and deliberate practice are in great detail, but I have got some books at the end, some suggested books for people to read if they're interested. But essentially, instructional coaching is, you know, observing a new teacher, seeing them teach, But rather than giving them a load of feedback as we tend to do, this was good, this was good, this was good, try working on this, try working on that. You give a single highly focused action step which they have to improve for next week. And it's that one thing to focus on, that really high leverage improvement that they can focus on. They're not trying to spin multiple plates. They just know that if they can nail that one thing, it's going to improve their teaching, and then the following week they'll be able to move on to something else. And deliberate practice is that basically being given that time to practice those actions outside the classroom setting. Teaching, again, I'm sure many of you have heard a lot about this and done a lot of reading about this. But teaching is a performance profession. Once you're up there in front of the class, you don't have time to stop. You don't have time to have a do-over, to go and sort of read your plan and lead the class to it. You just have to be able to carry on. And when we're doing that, we tend to behave in the way that we've always behaved, and we sort of revert to our habits. And deliberate practice is trying to, again, identify some of those key actions that instructional coaching might have brought up, and then give teachers a chance to practice them again and again outside the classroom, so that when they are in the classroom, they will do the right thing, they'll make the right call, and sort of develop their habits in that way. And again, this was seen everywhere. An extreme example, but an incredibly interesting one, Match Education in Boston. Their trainee teachers who they trained over the course of a year, over that year, every Saturday, they would meet for a 6-hour session. And this session was called Group of Six. And basically 6 trainees formed a small group. It was the same group every weekend for a year. And all they did in that time, so several hours on a Saturday, was that they would teach a lesson that they were going to be teaching, or part of a lesson, in the following week. And their other trainees would be students, and they'd be behaving in a variety of different ways, giving correct answers, giving wrong answers, showing challenging behavior. And they would practice these short episodes from these lessons again and again and again, every weekend, different lessons, different behaviors from the children. And the participants that I spoke to, the trainee teachers who were getting this, they said, look, it's grueling, it's hard work, it's basically doing 6 days a week, but it makes you so much better, so much more quickly. And the way that they talked about that, and the strength in their practice that I saw when I watched them teach in the classroom. And these are the equivalent of NQTs, the people that I spoke to. So it was September, the beginning of the school year, and they'd done a year of training before, and you would not have known that they were not very, very experienced teachers. And they pinpointed this relentless practice as being the key thing that really made them improve. So again, this is something that maybe stood in opposition to what I was seeing a lot in the UK. I feel like we can often be quite insular, and thinking about Ollie's containers and things within and without things, and we sort of keep to ourselves as a container within school. If we have trainees, we might have tutors and mentors who come in occasionally to support. We might have links with universities, with charities, with other organisations or other schools. But generally, we kind of like to do the thing that we do in our own schools and just get on with it. But this was a sort of really stark difference in some of the organisations that I looked at and that I worked with. So, for example, Relay, who's one of their graduate schools, their lecturers, essentially, who would give them their lectures, would also be the same people who went into their schools, and they'd go in sort of every week, and they'd actually be the ones who did instructional coaching with the trainees on a weekly basis. Now, if you can imagine being a head teacher and having someone from an external organisation coming into your school every single week and observing one of your teachers and giving them advice on how to improve, I think that's something that lots of people might not feel particularly comfortable with, with that regularity. An even more extreme example of that was Blue Engine. They actually they train teachers, and they'll tend to put a number of trainees within a school, and they will have one of their sort of higher level trainers. They will be based in that school for the whole academic year. That will be their workplace. They won't just come in and visit. They will have a desk in an office somewhere within that school, and they're not employed by the school. And I think that level of partnership is something that I've not really seen to that extent in the UK. And again, it just facilitates so much sort of collaboration and unity of direction with the school and the trainees and the sort of partner organisations. In North Carolina, their new teacher improvement project, who I worked with, they were really, really clear that all of their instructional coaches were from university partners and were, experienced teacher trainers. And they were the ones going into schools, working with hundreds and hundreds of trainees. This is across the whole state. And without that large-scale partnership, they really weren't able to do that. So I think that sort of expertise and different organisations working very, very closely together was, again, really sort of noticeable. Let's let you read. And this was sort of the last thing that I noticed that I thought was absolutely key. All of these organisations had gone through a process where they had codified exactly what good teaching and learning was, what it looked like, and they'd said it explicitly. Now, I think as teachers, we often feel that we have an understanding of what we think good teaching and learning looks like. And I think within schools as well, that you can generate a shared understanding. But I think that's often done tacitly. It's very, very rare that I see schools or organisations who have explicitly listed in a document, this is what good teaching and learning looks like. Now, I know that can be reductive. We can't sort of boil everything down to sort of a neat phrase, a neat bit of shared language. But it's so powerful because it says to trainee teachers, these are the things that we're going to be looking for. This is what good teaching looks like. This is what you should be aiming for. And when I was talking to the leaders within some of those organisations, they were all saying that, firstly, it was an iterative process. It took place over time. They'd draft it and then redraft and add to it and remove things and constantly get feedback. And they also said it was incredibly hard and I think, sometimes almost painful process. But they also said that it was absolutely worth it because it gave their organisation absolute clarity on what they were doing. And again, that was something that I, rarely felt that I saw in this country. So they were sort of my key findings, and again, things that I tended to see across multiple organisations. And so I've sort of come up with a series of 4 recommendations, and I suppose this is, how I think we should be looking at teacher training and then teacher induction in the first few years of people's careers. And that's the first one. This idea of new teachers working alongside an experienced colleague is, I think, absolutely the way to go. I think so many teachers leave the system. So many teachers, do not choose to stay as teachers for long periods because they don't have that support. They don't really know if what they're doing in the classroom is good because they're new, they're novices, of course. And even, with a lot of support from colleagues and from leaders, maybe with multiple observations over the course of the year. Even with all that, teachers are still by themselves for a long time and kind of floundering sometimes, I think. So if it were up to me, I would absolutely have it that that new teachers are always paired with a more experienced colleague for the first year, I would say, of their teaching. Now, if they were on a sort of university-based program like a PGCE, just with placements, I'm talking about their NQT year there. If it's someone doing schools direct or something, a PGC that's much more work-based and they're in school a lot during their training year, that would be during that year. But that is my first recommendation. I think that would do a huge amount to improve retention in the profession, and just, show our new teachers what they're doing well, what they could do better, and just giving them that feeling of constant support there. That's my second recommendation. And really, this is that idea of deliberate practice, that really, if we want teachers to behave differently in the classroom, we need to give them that deliberate practice. They need to have the opportunity to practice the moves that we want them to make in the classroom. lectures and seminars are absolutely brilliant for getting subject knowledge across, for improving teachers' subject knowledge, getting them to do professional learning. But in terms of actually changing the behaviour and the actions of teachers in the classroom, it's practice that is needed. And that practice needs to be guided, and it needs to have time given to it outside the classroom with an experienced colleague, a tutor or a mentor. This really is that idea of instructional coaching, that when we give teachers feedback, and we give new teachers feedback, we need to be getting them to focus on a single thing, a single action to improve, and have quite a short feedback loop. Again, maybe a week, 2 weeks at most, I would say. Currently, especially within ITT, we're bound in that teachers have to evidence all of the teacher standards, and mentors, when they're doing certainly formal observations, they normally have to write up a series of strengths and areas for development against the teacher standards. I would suggest wherever we can that we remove that and just give teachers, new teachers, one thing to focus on. Do this one thing and it will make your teaching better. And it's that sort of real clarity for them. And it means that their attention isn't split on multiple things and they're trying to do lots of things at once. And again, this is something that we're going to be doing with all of our NQTs and NQT plus one teachers from next year. We're completely changing the way that they're going to get feedback from their mentors. My final recommendation is to decide on what good looks like. So, this idea of codifying what good teaching and learning is, you need to do it, you need to write it down, and we need to be saying, this is what we think, good teachers are doing. There will be times when, we get it wrong and where we need to change it and edit it, and that's fine. That's what the process should be. But it's much, much better to produce something that's, really imperfect and then tweak it to make it better, rather than never do it because we're scared that we won't get it right. And I think a really powerful element of that is having a shared language as well, and that that trainees and teachers and leaders are all using the same language to describe teaching and learning, and so it's clear what they understand it to be. So I'm nearly done there, really. So in terms of the future and where I want to take this, obviously I said before I'm the head of the Step Ahead Teaching School, and we train teachers. So we have an ITT program. We do NQT and NQT plus one training. We do other CPD as well. And we're going to be rolling all of my recommendations really out in one way or another through the teaching school. In terms of wanting to sort of spread it more widely and do something bigger, that's definitely what I'm hoping to look at. I'm sure you'll know this organisation, the Institute for Teaching, and that was set up by this man, Matt Hood, and Matt Hood was actually a Churchill Fellow, and a lot of the ideas that he got for the Institute for Teaching came from the United States, and he actually met with some of the organisations that I met with as well, and he turned the Institute for Teaching into a really fantastic organisation that were doing some great stuff. And as I'm sure you all know, they merged with Ambition School Leadership to form Ambition Institute, which is now one of the biggest players sort of nationally in terms of CPD and developing teachers. And I think there is a lot of appetite for really powerful training and CPD for teachers in this country now, and so I'm hoping that in one way or another, whether it's just through the teaching school or maybe something more widely, that I'll be able to contribute to that. And really, I'd sort of charge all of you to just consider, this might come through in some questions at the end, if you're a teacher, you're also a teacher educator. There'll be, whether it's an NQT, whether it's a trainee, whether it's less experienced colleagues, whether it's colleagues who, even if you're an NQT and you've got other NQTs with you, we are all involved in teacher education in some way. And it's absolutely crucial to the system. I can never remember who said this quote. It may have been Dylan William, but it might be someone else. That the quality of a school system or of a school is necessarily limited by the quality of its teachers. So we need good schools for our pupils, and to have that, we need good teachers. And so just have a consider as well if any of these elements you're able to take back into your own classrooms, your own schools, and start to develop them really. Just the last couple of minutes, I'm a sort of prolific reader, read an absolute load, and I'm just going to share some books that were particularly helpful. I think if you're interested in the sort of instructional coaching side of things or deliberate practice, these are all really, really useful books. Leverage Leadership being the book that sort of first introduced me to the idea of instructional coaching. Practice Perfect, for anyone who's a coach of any kind, in or outside education, that's an incredibly useful book. This Deliberate Practice Handbook from Ambition Institute is a wonderful publication, and if you're interested to find out more about how you can support teachers through the use of deliberate practice, that's a free download that you can get online. And then walkthroughs, Get Better Faster, and Teach Like a Champion all give fantastic advice in terms of some of those techniques that new teachers can use. Just a couple of other interesting books. The first is called How the Other Half Learns. That's by Robert Pondisio, and he is an ex-teacher, now a journalist, I think, and sort of commentator. But he spent a year in Success Academies, who I mentioned before. So they were a charter school that I wasn't able to get into. Quite a controversial organisation, and the way that they do things and organise their schools is very controversial, I think internationally and in the United States. But when you look at the results that they get, they are the outlier of outliers. If you take, the 10 best sort of school networks, charter school organisations in New York State, for instance, if you take the very 10 best, they are the best of that 10 by an awfully long way. That they get success that's unprecedented. And Mission Possible there is a book written by Eva Moskowitz, who's the CEO of Success Academy. So How the Other Half Learns is probably the best book I've read this year, and not just education books. I highly recommend it. So the final thing to say is that all of what I've been saying to you today is sort of summarised in my report, which is called Strong Start, because I think that's what we need to give teachers. But also a nod, obviously, to Teach Like a Champion and Douglas, because it is one of the techniques. And yeah, it would be remiss of me not to mention as well that I have written a book about primary mathematics called Mastering Primary Mathematics, which is not about initial teacher education, but still may be of interest to you. So yes, you can follow me on Twitter at TJP Garry. And that's all from me really. So I'm going to throw it open to sort of Q&A. I've just put one of my favourite pictures there. And if you thought the content of the talk was not very interesting, but you like the pictures, that's my Instagram there. So feel free to give me a follow there, and I'll throw it open to the floor and see if we've got any questions.
Tom, thank you so much for that. I've written loads down, by the way. There's so much in there in terms of recommendations. It's really clear. Obviously, that idea of mastery and that coaching and being deliberate with everything we do just runs through, really, obviously the primary mastery as well, book that you've written. I've just got a few questions. If anyone has got a question, please put it in the chat now. My first question then is, you talked about the trust in Boston, where they were grouped in 6 trainee teachers, and they did it on a Saturday. Love the idea about that, by the way. Saturday clearly not a problem for me. Doing it on a Saturday. But what space is provided for this to happen? Physical space. Where does it happen, and what's that associated with? And then that time space as well. Certainly, perhaps during the teaching week, is the load reduced, or they have in comparison to UK teachers? So the question is really what space is provided then for those trainees to be able to do that?
Yeah, so I think in terms of physical space, they come together at some. I think they've got offices within one of their schools, so I wasn't able to actually see Group of Six take place, but I did hear a lot of people talking about it. Yeah, they'd get together and they would just, yeah, as I said, run these parts of lessons. I think in terms of the sort of mental space. Well, I think one of the key things is, firstly, they do follow that residency model. So when they're teaching during the week, they're not the only class teacher. They're working alongside a very experienced colleague who is the one that's ultimately responsible for the class. So I think they'll have time to, to think and reflect during their school day in a way that a teacher who's teaching by themselves would not be able to do. But I think also it's, I think there's an element where they, the graduate school, Charles Passato, just use it almost as a selling point that, look, it's going to be intense. You're going to be teaching in school during the week, and you're going to have this on a Saturday. But we feel that it's going to make you, an unusually strong early teacher. And, again, all the participants that I spoke to really bought into that vision, and then felt that it had that effect, in terms of getting them started in their careers. And again, I absolutely saw that reflected in the, in some of the lessons that I was in, and we had, teachers in their first year, so who'd done, 1 year of training, teaching lessons that I would have been absolutely proud to have taught myself. So, yeah.
So Dave Weston, I think, talks about a collegiate culture, doesn't he? Across this academy school, really vital for that, and clearly that then is across the six teachers. Then, I presume, are in different schools as well, aren't they?
Some will be in the same school, some will be across different ones, but they're in the same group of 6 over the course of the year.
Yeah, which brings in
really strong relationship. Yeah.
Which brings in another point then, is the fact that this idea as well of subject communities, actually that some small schools, they've only got perhaps one geography teacher, so perhaps that need then for that, that wider scope of a subject community as well. Will hopefully be important in a teacher's early years, maybe.
Yeah.
I've got a question, not mine this time. Clary, yes, no, I did write this down actually. So, Tom, do you think that the training to teach bursary has an impact on teacher retention?
To be honest, so I don't really know. So I'm not enough of an expert on it to say that it definitely does. But I would kind of, I think it's probably a laudable attempt to increase retention, and I think it makes a lot of sense. I think ultimately, it's probably not going to be enough to get the numbers and the types of teachers that we need, because I think teaching is really, really, really hard, and as we all know, and it's an intense job and it's a tough job, and I think bursaries can be helpful in terms of enticing people in the door, but I think long term, if it's not something that people are really passionate about and interested in, then we're not going to see that. It might have an effect of retention in the first, few years or whatever period of time. But in the long term, I think we're not going to be, it's probably not going to fix. I suppose it's maybe a sticking plaster rather than a full cure.
Yeah. Golden handcuffs, I think, was a term we used to use, wasn't it? Get them in, lock them in. Why not? With a bit of money. That's brilliant. Tom, thank you again for that. I've written loads to reflect on from that. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Pleasure. Thank you.
Don't end anything. Let me just read it.
I'll stop showing my screen.
I've learned.
Thank you, Tom. I think I'm just having to take. So far everything's been amazing, and then I'm just having to take a bit of time to reflect. There's so much to take from that. So much, and so much to think about as well, because if we look at our own systems that we've currently got in our schools, we know things aren't perfect, and it's just like, actually, there's so much more we could do, so many simple changes that we could make. Yeah. It's again, isn't it, it's like Matt with the whiteboard thing this morning. That blew me away. Do them in rows. And then there's this as well, so simple, and we just
I think what's hard, and something that the teacher gap was really good for as well, is that there are some things that we just have to accept as teachers. We have to leave to policy. Try as we might, we don't have control over, say, the money that we're getting in. But at the same time, there are lots of things that we can do. And so it's looking at those, like maybe, you know, what might seem like small wins or you know, small incremental changes that we can make. But, you know, over a period of time, over a number of schools and over a system, that can end up having a huge change. So I think, you know, it's, we can't do everything, but there is a lot that we can do.
Yeah. Brilliant. Thank you.
Cheers, Tom. Thank you. Right. So if I, Kath, if I allow you to be the host, if it doesn't work, just shout at me. It's fine. Let's have a look. Make host. Yes.
Fabulous. Thank you, everybody.
Kath, has that worked?
Can you hear me?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. We shall see when I try and share my screen if we can. Just